Hello guys and welcome back to Indian Grizzly. I'm pretty sure that most of you all are aware about the 1962 war that we had with China. India lost that war and it faced a huge setback. India's mentality, India's approach towards China became very defensive post that war. But however, we lost that war due to our unpreparedness and India was quick to realize on that, and post the 1962 war, India started preparing itself for its future challenges. Shortly after that, we had the 1965 war with Pakistan. And while we were facing a lethal enemy on one corridor of our nation, from the other corridor, the Chinese troops were constantly harassing our soldiers and troops. They used to call out our troops using loudspeakers, asking them to move out of certain territories. China was basically launching a psychological warfare on the Indian troops stationed in our borders. They used to tell them to move out of territories and constantly harass them, reminding them of the 1962 war. This was going on for almost 5 years, and even when India was having a war with Pakistan in 65, China was constantly in favor of Pakistan and they were using this as an opportunity to expand their territory and come inside India. This is happening to this very day, but this event that we are talking about happened in 1967, 5 years post the 62 war, and little did the Chinese knew about the carnage that the Indian troops were going to unleash upon them. This is the untold story of the face-off between India and China at the Nathu Pass 1967. It was the September of 1967 when the Chinese troops were trespassing inside the Indian territory and they were laying out trenches, literally constructing trenches for their soldiers inside the Indian territory. And this is not something that the Chinese did for the first time. Usually whenever this happened, there used to be a lot of tension between both the troops, but Indian troops constantly drove Chinese troops outside our territories. But this time, things got a little out of hand. When the Indian troops confronted the Chinese and asked them to stop their work immediately, it led to a brawl. It led to a face-off between both the armies and they started beating up each other. No bullets were fired, but however, the Chinese suffered a lot of head injuries, lot of blood injuries, fractures, and Indians forcefully had to drive them outside the territory of Nathu. The Indian troops immediately uprooted all the fences and the barbed wires that the Chinese had left behind. The Indian troops were very well aware of what the Chinese were trying to do here. They knew that they were eyeing for Nathu for a long period of time now, because Nathu is a place between the Sikkim border and the Tibetan border. It had a very big strategical advantage and also a geographical advantage. So if the Chinese were able to capture this place, it would directly lead them to Siliguri and they could take control over a lot of area in India, and the Indians would just not let that happen. The officer in command, the Indian officer in command during that time was General Sagar, and he refused to pull his troops back. He got into an argument with a lot of his superiors, but that did not stop him. They stationed troops there, but the Chinese who went back to their post did not accept this because they were injured, and the Chinese commander at that time, without thinking twice, he immediately ordered all his Chinese troops to open fire at the Indian soldiers, and they used medium range machine guns to open fire at the Indian soldiers, and straight away, right there, 70 Indian soldiers died and the remaining had to fall back to let people know what happened. But China did not predict the carnage that was about to get unleashed upon them, because India was not the same India that it was back in 1962. Post the 1962 war, it started deploying a lot of Indian soldiers, building military posts, bunkers, and developed its chain of ammunition, artillery machines. India was fully prepared for this, but China had no idea what was coming their way. The Indian soldiers immediately started mapping all the Chinese positions inside the Indian territory, and they launched a full-on artillery attack, a full-on military attack with artillery vehicles and medium-range rifles and machine guns. And the Chinese troops were baffled by this. They did not know how to counter this massive Indian attack, and they had no other option other than retreating from the Indian territory. Rounds and rounds of bullets were fired, and almost 350 to 400 Chinese troops were killed between September 11th, 1967 to September 15th, 1967. Even the Chinese government threatened the Indian army to unleash their air force upon them, but the Indian soldiers just didn't care. They constantly drove them outside our territory all the way back to China, and on September 15th, 1967, the Chinese government had to take the Indian government's permission to come inside our Indian territory to collect their scattered bodies which was inside the territory of India. And post this scene, both the Chinese government and the Chinese media remained completely silent about what happened, because they felt that this was a huge humiliation for them, because they misunderstood. They underestimated India. They thought that India was the same India that it was back in 62, but little did they know that India was fully prepared for this, and India was also an emerging military powerhouse. Now this is one problem that we have with our older generation. They always think or assume that whenever there was a standoff between India and China, India suffered more casualties than the Chinese. That is not true. To anybody who tells you, don't let anybody tell you that whenever India and China faced off, India suffered more casualties. There are numerous number of incidences where our brave hearts, our brave soldiers gave it back to the Chinese much harder than they expected. And this is just one such incident. There are numerous number of incidences like this. For example, something similar happened in Rasangla during the 62 Indo-China war, where 1,000 Chinese troops were killed when they tried to enter inside Rasangla. And the famous story of Jashwant Singh, a man, an Indian soldier who single-handedly battled and killed 250 to 300 Chinese troops. I will make a separate video on both that incidences. But this video is completely about the untold story of what happened between India and China in Nathu from September 11th, 1967 to September 15th, 1967. No Chinese media is going to talk about this, but it is our duty to preserve, to read and to know our history, because if we don't do it, somebody else will create a fake version and they will do what you are supposed to do. So that's it for today's video, guys. I hope you found it useful and informative. Share this video with somebody who would love these kind of topics, and if you want me to talk about something else, leave it down in the comment section below. And until I see you again with another video like this, take care, stay safe and stay home. Jai Hind.
Take it.